For more than a century, gold has lived in the public imagination as honest money, something real, something governments could not fake, dilute, or manipulate at will. That is why, whenever inflation rises, debt swells, or trust in central banks begins to crack, the same idea returns. Go back to gold. Go back to discipline. Go back to money anchored to something the state cannot simply create. But history leaves behind a harder question. If gold was the safeguard, why did governments keep abandoning it? Why did nations that praised gold as the foundation of stability suspend it in war, weaken it in crisis, and eventually walk away from it when the pressure became too great? This is not just a story about monetary theory. It is a story about power under stress. Because money is never only money. It is the architecture of trust, the wiring of debt, the hidden grammar of trade, wages, order, and survival. And when history turns violent, governments do not choose the purest system. They choose the one that lets them endure. The gold standard is often remembered as a monument to stability, a world of fixed value, disciplined states, and money tied to something solid beneath politics. But that memory is cleaner than the history itself. Gold did not prevent manias. It did not stop credit from expanding too far. It did not spare banks from panic or societies from collapse when confidence began to drain away. That is the central paradox. A system built to inspire trust was repeatedly abandoned at the exact moment trust was tested most severely. Not in peace, when rules were easy to praise, but in war, in banking stress, in debt crises, in moments when governments had to choose between defending the promise of gold and defending the survival of the system around it. And that choice changed everything. Because once money is tied to gold, instability does not disappear. It simply takes a different form. Pressure moves into credit, into wages, into debt, into the lives of people forced to carry the cost of keeping the currency sound. To understand why governments kept leaving gold, you have to go back to a world before modern central banks, before floating currencies, before finance became an invisible network of digits and policy meetings. In that older world, money had to survive distance. It had to survive borders. It had to survive dynasties, wars, and the collapse of one ruler after another. That is what made gold so powerful. It endured. It did not rot like grain, crack like clay, or lose itself like promises made by frightened states. It could be divided, weighed, stored, and carried. And across very different civilizations, it was recognized. That mattered. Because gold was never valuable only as metal. Its deeper power came from what people believed it could do. Hold value across time. Settle debts across cultures. Preserve trust when political systems changed. So, long before gold became the centerpiece of formal monetary policy, it had already become something larger, a foundation, not just of exchange, but of confidence, not just of wealth, but of a monetary promise people thought might outlive power itself. By the late 19th century, gold no longer functioned only as an ancient store of value. It became the spine of an international order. Britain led the way. Sterling was fixed to gold. Other major powers followed. And once the great industrial economies began tying their currencies to the same metal, something new emerged. A monetary world that appeared stable, legible, and disciplined. Exchange rates between major currencies stopped behaving like political weather. They became predictable. Merchants could plan farther ahead. Investors could move capital across borders with greater confidence.
Banks could extend credit across oceans without fearing that money itself would suddenly shift beneath them. This changed more than finance. It changed the pace of trade, the scale of empire, the reach of contracts, and the confidence with which industrial societies organized the future. London stood at the center of it all, not just as a city of banks, but as a clearinghouse for trust. From the outside, the gold standard looked almost elegant, a cleaner system, a civilized system, a world where money seemed anchored, states seemed restrained, and order itself appeared measurable. That was the beauty of it, and, eventually, the danger.
But the elegance of the gold standard concealed a structural flaw. The entire monetary order rested on a single physical metal. That meant the supply of money could not expand simply because trade expanded, cities grew, factories multiplied, or populations demanded more credit. It could grow only as fast as gold could be mined, refined, transported, and absorbed into the system. And economies were beginning to move much faster than that. Industrial production surged. Railroads stretched across continents. Ports deepened. Empires widened their commercial reach. Banks wrote more claims on the future, but gold remained stubbornly physical, slow to find, slow to extract, slow to move. That mismatch mattered, because when the economy grows faster than the money beneath it, pressure does not vanish. It travels. It moves into prices, into credit, into debt burdens that grow heavier precisely when societies are trying to expand. So beneath the calm surface of fixed exchange rates and disciplined states, a silent tension was building. The system looked stable, but it was already asking the real economy to bend itself around the limits of a metal pulled from the ground. This is where the gold standard becomes more dangerous than it first appears. When people hear the word deflation, it can sound harmless, even attractive. Prices fall, goods become cheaper, money seems to go farther. But an economy is not a shopping list. It is a web of wages, contracts, loans, and expectations. And when prices fall across that web, the pain does not spread evenly. A farmer sells his crop for less. A manufacturer earns less for the same output. A merchant watches revenue shrink while rent, payroll, and interest still wait at the end of the month. That is the trap. Income falls first. Debt does not. The loan taken in better times does not become smaller because prices have fallen. The bond does not grow lighter. The mortgage does not become more forgiving. So the real burden rises. And once enough people are forced into that position, they cut hiring, delay investment, cancel orders, and cling to cash. What looks like monetary discipline at the top becomes social pressure underneath. Under gold, the suffering was never just statistical. It settled on producers, borrowers, workers, and communities trying to expand in a system that made money harder precisely when survival required more of it. In the late 19th century United States, this pressure was not abstract. It landed on farms. American farmers borrowed to buy land, seed, tools, and machinery. They borrowed because expansion demanded it. Railroads had opened new territory. Markets stretched farther. Production scaled up. And debt became part of ordinary rural life. That worked until prices fell. A farmer could harvest the same wheat, haul the same cotton, work the same acres, and still bring home less money than the year before. Not because he had failed, but because the price of what he sold kept sinking beneath him. His debt, meanwhile, did not sink with it. The mortgage stayed fixed. The loan on equipment stayed fixed. The interest still came due in dollars that had grown harder to earn.
and that changed the politics of money. To creditors, hard money meant confidence. To debtors, it meant suffocation. To financial centers in the East, gold looked like order. To producers across the rural West and South, it looked like a system designed to protect lenders while grinding down the people who made the country run. That is why free silver was never only about silver. It was a revolt against a monetary order that felt mathematically clean and socially cruel.
By 1896, the argument over gold had outgrown economics. It had become political theater, moral accusation, and social conflict compressed into a single question. Who was this stability really for? In the presidential election of that year, money moved to the center of national life, not as a technical issue for bankers and ministers, but as a public fight over debt, power, and sacrifice. The gold standard was no longer being defended as a neat monetary mechanism. It was being defended as order itself. And that changed the stakes. Because once money becomes a symbol of order, anyone who challenges it can be cast as reckless, dangerous, uncivilized. But to millions of debtors, farmers, and producers, the deeper danger looked very different. They believed the country was being asked to protect the value of money by crushing the people who had to earn it. That was the emotional force behind the famous cross of gold moment. Not just anger at a policy, but outrage at a system that seemed willing to sacrifice whole classes of people in the name of stability. So even in the so-called Golden Age, gold was already dividing the nation. It created winners and losers long before it ever collapsed. Then came 1914, and with it, the kind of pressure the gold standard was never truly built to survive. World War I did not just raise military spending. It transformed the scale of the state. Governments suddenly had to finance mass armies, rail transport, artillery, ammunition, food supply, shipbuilding, medical care, and the continuous movement of industrial war across entire continents. This required money on a scale no peacetime gold system could comfortably provide. Not slowly, not cautiously, immediately. War does not wait for mining output. It does not pause for reserve ratios. It does not ask whether convertibility can be preserved with elegance. It demands mobilization. And that changed the question completely. The issue was no longer whether gold imposed discipline in normal times. The issue was whether a government at war would protect the promise to redeem paper for metal or protect the state itself. That is the real turning point. Because once survival enters the frame, monetary purity becomes a luxury. In wartime, money stops being only a measure of value. It becomes fuel for transport, steel for shells, bread for soldiers, credit for industry, and debt for national endurance. And when a system cannot finance survival fast enough, governments do not hesitate for long. And then the break came. Not gradually, not after years of careful philosophical reconsideration. Almost at once. The great powers suspended gold convertibility, expanded the money supply, issued debt, and redirected the machinery of finance toward war. This is the moment when the gold standard reveals its deepest truth. Its discipline lasted only as long as the state could afford to obey it. Once national survival was threatened, the rules that had been praised as civilized restraint were pushed aside with astonishing speed. Paper claims multiplied, borrowing surged, war finance overwhelmed peacetime orthodoxy. That matters, because the gold standard is often remembered as if it stood above politics,
as if it could restrain governments by force of principle alone. But in 1914, history exposed the limit of that belief. Gold could discipline power only until power needed to betray it. And when that moment arrived, governments did not hesitate between theory and survival for very long. They chose survival. They chose military supply over monetary purity, debt issuance over convertibility, administrative flexibility over metallic honor. So the first great break in the gold order was not just a policy change. It was the collapse of an illusion that money could remain pure when the state itself was fighting to endure.
When the war ended, many governments told themselves a comforting story. The chaos had been temporary. The monetary disorder had been exceptional. The old world, they believed, had not truly died. It had only been interrupted. So, after 1918, the desire to return to gold was not just economic. It was psychological, diplomatic, civilizational. Gold still carried the prestige of the pre-war order. It meant financial honor, international credibility, a promise that states could still be trusted, contracts still respected, and money still anchored to something beyond political strain. That is why so many policymakers wanted restoration. They did not want merely to rebuild a currency system. They wanted to recover a lost image of normality. But history had moved on. The war had changed prices, debts, production, labor, and the scale of government itself. Societies had been militarized, economies distorted, balance sheets shattered. The world that had once fit the gold standard no longer existed in the same form. And yet governments tried to force that changed world back into the old frame. That was the danger. Because nostalgia can make broken systems look like principles. And once leaders began treating pre-war stability as something that could simply be restored, they turned memory into policy. Britain became the clearest test of this illusion. In 1925, the British government returned sterling to gold at the old pre-war parity. On paper, it looked like restoration, a proud nation reclaiming monetary discipline, a financial center reasserting its prestige. But the number was wrong. The war had changed prices, costs, wages, and the real position of the British economy. By restoring the pound at the old rate, Britain made its currency too strong for the world it actually inhabited. That carried a price. British exports became harder to sell. Factories faced weaker demand. Coal, steel, and other heavy industries came under strain. And the pain did not begin in the city of London. It began in working towns. It began in mining districts, industrial ports, and households already living close to the edge. Unemployment rose, production slowed. Communities built around labor were asked to absorb the cost of defending a monetary image. John Maynard Keynes saw the danger early. He understood that Britain was trying to preserve the appearance of stability by forcing the real economy to bleed beneath it. That is what made the decision so cruel. The pound looked dignified. The system looked restored. But behind that polished surface, the country was being pressed into economic pain so that finance could pretend the old world still existed. This is where the gold standard turned from a rigid system into a destructive one. To stay on gold, central banks had to defend confidence, and confidence under that system meant reserves. If gold began to leave the country, policymakers had only a few tools: raise interest rates, tighten credit, slow lending, protect the currency even if the economy beneath it began to suffocate. That was the mechanism. And when the shock of 1929 arrived, it became fatal. What the world needed then was flexibility, lower rates, more liquidity, room to absorb panic
before panic became collapse. But gold pushed in the opposite direction. Governments feared that easing too much would weaken their currencies, trigger reserve losses, and destroy faith in convertibility. So instead of cushioning the fall, they hardened it. Banks became more fragile. Credit contracted further. Businesses lost access to money. Trade shrank. Employment broke. This was the paradox at its most brutal. To save the currency, governments crushed the economy that gave the currency meaning. Gold was supposed to impose discipline. In crisis, it imposed paralysis. And once that logic took hold across multiple countries at the same time, the monetary system stopped containing panic. It began manufacturing it.
Then the system began to break in full view. Banks failed. Production collapsed. Unemployment surged. Trade across the world contracted as fear moved faster than goods, faster than credit, faster than confidence itself. This was no longer a debate about monetary doctrine. It was social ruin. Factories went quiet. Households lost income. Businesses disappeared. And governments, still trying to defend gold, kept tightening into the collapse instead of easing against it. That is what made the Depression so revealing. Gold no longer behaved like a fortress against panic. It behaved like an amplifier. Britain left gold in 1931. The United States broke its domestic gold constraint in 1933. And one of the most important patterns in modern monetary history began to emerge. Countries that abandoned gold earlier often recovered earlier. That matters because it reverses the old story. The system that was supposed to preserve order had become one of the mechanisms deepening disorder. The discipline once praised as responsible now looked indifferent to mass unemployment, industrial failure, and social exhaustion. By the early 1930s, the truth was harder to hide. Gold was no longer protecting economies from crisis. It was helping crisis spread through them. After the Great Depression and the Second World War, the world did not return to the old gold standard. It built something more flexible, or so it seemed. Under Bretton Woods, gold no longer sat directly beneath every major currency. Instead, the system was layered. The dollar was tied to gold. Other currencies were tied to the dollar. On the surface, this looked smarter than the old arrangement. It preserved a gold anchor without forcing every country to defend large reserves on its own. It gave the post-war world a center of gravity, a common reference point for trade, investment, and reconstruction. And for a time, it worked. But the stability came with a hidden condition. The world had to trust that the United States could honor a promise that kept getting harder to keep. As global trade expanded, more dollars moved abroad. More reserves were held outside the United States. More claims accumulated on the stock of gold that was not growing at the same speed. So the old contradiction returned in a new form. The system looked stable because pressure had been concentrated into one pillar instead of many. But that also meant the entire order depended on whether one country could keep converting paper claims into metal without breaking under the weight of global demand. By 1971, the final strain could no longer be hidden. Too many dollars had accumulated outside the United States. Too many claims now rested on a gold stock that had not expanded with the scale of the post-war world. And that was the problem. The system did not break because gold had lost its symbolic power. It broke because the world built after 1945 had become too large, too liquid, too interconnected to remain anchored to a metal moving at geological speed. Trade had expanded, finance had deepened,
Dollar claims had spread across continents, but the promise at the center of the system still said that paper could ultimately be turned into gold. By then, that promise had become too heavy to carry. So when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the last formal link between global money and gold was severed. Not because the world had stopped respecting gold, but because gold could no longer bear the weight of the system built around it. That is what made the moment so decisive. An era ended, not with a philosophical surrender, but with an admission of scale. The post-war financial order had grown beyond what metallic convertibility could sustain. And from that point on, the world would live fully inside a new reality. Money backed not by metal, but by institutions, state power, and managed belief.
The fiat world did not abolish crisis. It did not abolish inflation. It did not abolish bubbles. It did not abolish banking panic, sovereign stress, or the human tendency to mistake credit expansion for durable wealth. What it changed was something narrower and more important. It gave governments and central banks room to respond when the system began to fracture. That does not make fiat money pure. It makes it elastic. And that elasticity is exactly what gold could not provide when pressure turned systemic. Under gold, the question was often how much pain a society would accept in order to defend the currency. Under fiat, the question becomes different. How much instability, inflation, and political discretion a society will tolerate in order to prevent collapse. That is the modern argument. Not honest money versus dishonest money. Not metal versus paper in the abstract. But what kind of failure a society fears more? The slow suffocation of rigid money, or the long-term risk of flexible money managed by fallible institutions? That is why the debate never disappears. Because money is still doing what it has always done. It is deciding who absorbs the shock when order begins to crack. Governments did not leave gold because gold was meaningless. They left it because the modern world kept demanding more from money than metal alone could provide. Gold could anchor trust. It could restrain expansion. It could impose limits. But when war arrived, when debt accumulated, when panic spread, when unemployment threatened the fabric of society, those limits stopped looking like virtue and started looking like a barrier to action. And that is the deeper lesson. Monetary systems are not judged only by how pure they appear in theory. They are judged by what they allow states to do when order begins to fail. Again and again, governments chose capacity over purity, flexibility over convertibility, intervention over metallic discipline. Not because gold had no power, but because political survival, social stability, and economic endurance carried more weight than the promise to redeem paper for metal. That is why money is never just a neutral measure of value. It decides who gets rescued, who gets squeezed, which debts are protected, which institutions are preserved, which forms of order survive the shock. And once you see that, the history of gold becomes something larger than a debate about sound money. It becomes a history of power, deciding what must be saved when the system begins to crack.